Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our final webinar of this current series. Tonight we have Paul Lewis, who is a senior lecturer in agriculture and environment, in the agriculture and environment department at Harper Adams. He's mainly involved in teaching both undergraduates and postgraduates, delivering agronomy and environmental training to them. But he also has many years of research and interest in soil, water, nutrients and manures. So tonight he's going to give you an insight on how muck and slurries can be more useful, hopefully, and how useful they are on your farms. So I think without further ado, I'll hand you over to Paul. But this week, if you do want to ask a question as we go through, do either use the raise a hand function or type it in the chat, and I will interrupt Paul as we go through and either invite you to ask your question if you raise your hand, or I'll read it out to Paul. So yep, over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming along tonight. Really appreciate that, and for the opportunity just to talk to you this evening. I hope it's not going to be a case of teaching Granny to suck eggs a bit, but just really sort of a broad brush approach to have a bit of a think about better valuing slurry and muck, both in terms of farm systems, but also keeping on the right side of all the ever-changing regs and advice that comes in there. And I realise that, I'm sure I'm in the company of a huge range of audiences just in terms of location as well, and probably different countries in terms of our requirements in terms of slurry regs and the whole system linked into that. So yeah, as Katie said, please do interrupt as we go along. I'm going to share the screen in a sec. Once I do that, I won't see any of your good selves or the chat, so I'm quite happy if via Katie you just sort of interrupt me as we go along. There'll be a couple of polls that Katie's going to do for me fairly early on. I'm interested just to sort of hear a yes/no answer, really, just in terms of slurry analysis or muck analysis, and just any valuing that you have from your end. Okay, I'll share the screen, and then hopefully all will be okay in terms of showing you that.
Yep, we can see your screen fine, Paul.
Okay, brilliant. So the whole value of muck and mystery, and where there's muck, there's brass, and let's think about trying to get some value on it in terms of some of the whole system that we're thinking about. Really the promotion of your system, and we think about sustainability, efficiency, the promotion of environmentally minded and production joined in together, that we would essentially be dealing with there. But where do others see us in terms of the whole aspect of muck management then? Is it a case of a good quality natural material, something to get rid of? Who are we trying to work with? I'm sure for some of you, the whole delights are the headaches in terms of slurry and muck production. This particular winter, just in terms of the amount of rain that's got into the system that we're dealing with, the soil aspects. If we think about maybe later on in the year, the whole issue of spreading, when can we spread? The whole aspect may be associated not only with what are the crops getting and the land getting, but also everybody who sees it, the neighbours, and all of the other aspects that we want to have a bit of a think about. 2 or 3 cartoons that I've sort of used in the past, sort of a little bit in terms of thinking more about sort of slurry and muck and effluent management. And that one there on the left, just thinking a little bit about what we are potentially linked into. If we're valuing it and using it in a most efficient way as a recyclable, organic, sustainable material that's going to ultimately improve the land, significantly help us in terms of reducing raw materials coming back in, hits the sustainability targets and the circular economy, but also mindful of our links then into the wider environment. And we hear a fair bit about the connection with muck and slurry management, with the aspects of water and soil and air pollution. And I suppose I've seen things go up and down, much like maybe some of yourselves. Things come round and round again in circles. And something that may have been in the attention 15, 20 years or so may come back again. Where do we think the main focus currently is? Associated with nutrient management, crop production, Is it waste management, or is it resource recycling that we want to have a think about? So the whole aspect about how much our land can take, the soil quality, the crop need, keeping hold of it in terms of best value. Where are some of the short-term effects if we lose it? Where are some of the long-term effects? Where does that hit some of the news, particularly when we think about some of the aspects of the public and what they hear in terms of water quality, soil and air management as well. So just a few numbers, and I realise this is just a typical survey, and part of that would be who is involved particularly with the survey, but every year in the springtime, the English Farm Practices Survey gets information chiefly for its modelling programme for greenhouse gas emission reductions, but part of that is linked into nutrient management planning. And we think where that incentivisation is coming forward now in our new support packages and schemes, the rollout of SFI here in England, the new targeted areas in nutrient management linked into that, soil quality, and the whole joined up approach. So here are the figures that were from last spring, reported last summer. These results get reported then in the summer, just giving us a bit of an idea of nutrient management planning and manure management planning. Of course, we could be involved linked into that with assurance and our requirements there in terms of our assured produce. But in terms of these numbers here, they're not dramatically changing year on year. There may be a few tweaks. I suppose tonight we're particularly interested in the bottom end of this particular table. Just over a half would have some form of assessment of the nutrient value of their muck or slurry that we would be dealing with there. And that's a broad brush approach, just in terms of that information could be gathered from somebody else, from the agronomist, feed rep, advisor, or is it a more proactive attempt to try and work out the value? I'm particularly interested in that if we reckon that nearly 1/5 would be actually analysing their manures as part of a regular process. So I've asked Katie just to set up a bit of a poll. I won't see that at the moment. So Katie, can you launch that one there, please? That first question, and then just report back to me just in terms of once we've got a bit of feedback.
Yeah, so I've launched the poll. Do you get your manure or slurry analysed? I hope that's the right poll to do first.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Katie.
So there's 4 responses so far, and it's 50-50. And now I've got 10 responses, and it's still 50-50.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
13 responses, and it's now 54% to no. Oh no. 14. we're back to 50-50. So about 50-50, I'd say.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, that's really good. Now, whether I think this is a sort of skewed audience, more proactive and absolutely willing as part of the agenda that you're working with, then I'm absolutely sure there. Can we shift on to the next question as well, please?
Yep. So the next one, do you account for your muck in nutrient planning? Yes, no, or sometimes? So we've had 13 responses, so 17 responses, 82% say yes, 12% say no, and 5% sometimes.
Yeah.
Now gone to 10% no, 85% yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just give it a sec, see if there's anyone else.
Yeah, so we've had 20 responses, 85% yes, 10% no, and 5% sometimes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, just interested to hear perhaps just to the audience we've got tonight and involved with the schemes that you're involved with. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Brilliant. Thanks for that. So let's just have a think about where we're using it. So essentially pretty broad range. So this is the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice results that come out every summer. So we're looking here for a 4-year period, and we're just looking at that range there of the crop area that is receiving some form of muck or slurry in different quantities. What we've not got here then is where that's produced by. We'll see in a moment that big tendency on cattle-based systems, just in terms of quantity. So based in here is obviously the geographical location, the cropping calendars, the timeliness of storage, the most suitability for the value of that in terms of potential fertilizer replacement that we're thinking about, whether we're thinking about solids or liquids, and generally that practicality then of using this material as effectively as possible that we'd be seeing there. But when we look at there, sort of over 4/5 of our maize ground typically could well be receiving some form of slurry or muck. Whether we think that is proactively, it's a material that we can well use there. But again, is that the best timing in terms of the quantity and the value that we think about? The discussion also that we've had certainly here in England over the recent years in terms of autumn applications, in terms of matching soil and crop need, particularly where that take-up of nutrients may be some considerable months after the application. And all of that debate as to that particular timing would be built into that graph that we can see there. And again, this is Great Britain. The British Survey of Fertiliser Practice reports results from 3 of our 4 nations, doesn't include Northern Ireland. And that's just showing us there, typically over a 3-year period, the percentage of ground that does receive it, how is that chiefly split? So those numbers basically adding up to 100 there. And, and we are chiefly looking at somewhere around 80% of that manured land is getting some form of cattle material, solid muck, semi-solids, slurry, separated or non-separated. Perhaps interesting to see where the stuff at the bottom maybe starting to slightly increase, still less than 10% where we think of non-farm materials coming in for value in use in terms of crop production, agronomy, and the value then of improving our land with non-farm produced organic materials, whether that's a nutrient aid or whether that's improving soil structure and organic matter that we'd be thinking about. Quite a bit of emphasis on the financial value and a real interest in that, particularly in the last few years when we think about the huge hike in prices, the volatility of that, definite money and muck. But there's a whole host of other factors built into this particular table here. If we just start to unpick it a bit, so these are results that I would have been using within the last couple of weeks or so on FACS fertilizer training. So what we're looking here would be 3 different types of material with an application rate that may be linked into guidance, where it's linked in possibly to NVZ law and some of the other requirements that we'd be thinking about. So 3 different rates in terms of volume or of weight at spreading. And then the main NPK value that we'd be looking about. So if we're going to make any comparisons with bag muck and the typical compound, where would be our fertilizer value that we'd be dealing with there? So just making comparisons with 3 main straits up at the top that we'd be dealing with there. So if we work out currently that that's just over £1 a kilo, so £1.3 for nitrogen. That would be looking for TSP, triple superphosphate, at just shy of £1 a kilo. And potash, the straight there, a muriate of potash, MOP, that's the cheapest at about 70p a kilo. And equating that then to the typical NP, P2O5 and K2O delivery with those quantities on the left-hand side that we'd be dealing with there. Typically, we'd be expressing that as available nitrogen, but total phosphate and potash, which we'll come on to have a think about at the moment. But adding up those 3 values then, on the right-hand side, we've got that financial value, that theoretical book financial value in nutrient saving in terms of bought-in material when worked out at that spread rate per hectare. We could look back a year to the equivalent prices of bought-in fertilizer at that particular time there. Still potential considerable value. This would be based on springtime application, which would really affect, for example, the available nitrogen that we'd be dealing with there. That's much more volatile in terms of the nitrogen delivery that we'd be getting from that particular material that we'd be seeing there. But of course, hidden into that is all of the other factors that wouldn't be that don't become apparent in there. This is just a theoretical book value in terms of equivalent nutrient intake. What are we dealing with then in terms of how much it's going to cost us to shift it around the farm, to store it, to pump it, to spread it? And also when we think about the fact that we've got considerable volume, maybe compared to a concentrated inorganic bag muck equivalent. If we go back a couple of previous years and bring in a few other materials, we'll see here some comparisons then against what have we got as an extra one here? We got pig muck, so pig FYM, we've got digestate. So whether that's farm produced digestate or imported material, maybe under a deployment system where it's food waste digestate, and then biosolids along the bottom, so sludge cake, sewage material that we'd be dealing with there. And perhaps one of the things to have a look at is that big variability in terms of nutrient content across those materials. Sizable value in strawed yard muck that we'd be thinking about there, and that big reliance on a potash content. And potash typically in most of our muck and slurry is pretty available, and so that will be giving us that considerable value where we could make effective use of that. If we shift to something like biosolids down at the bottom, we'll see a big difference, say, for comparison between phosphate and potash. Great source of phosphate in terms of land value, and in some cases, some concerns now about overloading phosphate with a heavy reliance on some of these bought-in materials. But then hardly any potash value that we would be seeing there. So mixed in terms of the nutrient value in there, they're compound materials. We need to think about what's the base total nutrients, but realistically, how much are we actually going to shift from that material towards the crop in terms of the efficiency of uptake. So hitting the targets, as I talked about right at the beginning then, so whether we've got an agenda for sustainability or recycling or a circular economy, making better use of raw materials, we can tick the boxes in many ways. So this could apply to the material you're producing and using for land value and soil improvement. And I know you've been sort of talking and dealing with over the last few weeks with some areas of updates on soil health and soil quality. It could be materials that are bought in, created elsewhere, maybe for some muck for straw exchanges or industrial waste spread. So there may be the big emphasis on fertilizer saving, and that may be the big nutrients, our NPK value. In some situations, it may be trace element value or micronutrients that we'd be dealing with there. Or we could tick the boxes for soil quality. Which types of materials are good at building up soil organic matter over time? More of a slow build approach. It may not be the quick hit nutrient saving, but we are going to get some value long term in workability of our land, in building soil organic matter, in carbon storage, in soil health and quality. And I think that will be a developing area. It's not going to give us quick answers. The whole aspect of how soil health is improved over time. It may be decades before we start to see some of that aspect of more information on the link between organic materials recycled on land and soil biology and soil health that we'd be thinking about. Practical and cost effective. Well, it's government policy to recycle industrial wastes back to land for value. It's seen as a sustainability agenda and best environmental practice to reuse materials back for land value, but we know some of the areas of concern. We'll talk a bit about nitrogen, great nutrient. Yeah.
There's a question, is the big figure of 376 for potash for farmyard manure in danger of leaching, or can the soil hold it?
Okay, right. Generally, what we'd be saying there is for potash, it won't leach as much in terms of the fat theoretically, but it is soluble. So yeah, if we're thinking about the timing across the year, quite a bit of that potash could be flushed through the soil if there's a fair amount of water moving through there. So certainly on lighter, sandier soils, where you've got a fair throughput of water, quite a lot of that potash is going to be 90% available in water-soluble form So yeah, theoretically, a significant amount of that potash could well be lost, linked into timing. No great major environmental concern with potash. I suppose more than anything else, it's money down the drain that we'd be thinking about there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hope that answers your question, Mike.
Yeah. So nitrogen, yeah, great material, but hugely complicated that we'll have a look at, and leaky. Big interest in phosphorus now. So the whole aspect of water quality, soil loss from the field, changing rules in our countries, different emphasis in terms of our internal governments, and bigger focuses. And of course, that's the aspect that hits the news in terms of the river quality, and the whole aspect linked into where does farming have a contribution linked in, for example, with things like sewage outfalls and phosphorus loading. If we would be shifting maybe into terms of some of our higher value fresh produce materials, they would have more concerns about pathogen transfer. And again, there may be certain specific protocols that restrict application of materials ahead of raw eaten crops and fresh produce. We've had a long-standing history of PTEs that's been more linked into, for example, sewage spread to land. Industrial wastes in terms of PTEs are significantly cleaner. And yes, there's imbalances with things like copper and zinc in terms of some of our pig slurries and poultry materials in terms of grazing considerations. But generally, the value is thinking about it's that balance between positives and negatives. We're not necessarily just using the land to get rid of a waste. We're thinking about an amendment which is providing value for future wholesome food production and soil improvement and soil health, together with the very bottom bit there, the practicalities of stock management. And when we can think about applications maybe onto silage ground or any potential contamination that could shift in terms of grazing or into the clamp and some of those areas. So certainly if we're bringing in imported materials that need to be deployed to land under waste restrictions, they'd be looking for the fact that benefits outweigh risks. So industrial materials spread back to land need to have some form of dedicated agricultural benefit. And realistically, we should be thinking about the same with the materials we produce on farm and apply back. Is that in terms of building up a nutrient bank? Is it in fertilizer saving? Is it a more long-term aspect that we'd be thinking about there? Workability, soil structure, starting to build organic matter where that's needed. We get some of the legislative requirements, whether we think these are realistic or not, that have historically been built into NVZs. Any of you, don't know at the moment across the border from me here, but just not far away over in Wales, big changes there in terms of slurry and muck management in basically creating the whole of Wales as a single NVZ equivalent. So we have a nitrogen loading onto our land on a field by field basis or based on a stocking rate that we'd be dealing with. And then the whole aspect of trying to avoid over enrichment is a developing area, and it's probably only going to get more tighter as we move through in there. So maybe there is a bit of an emphasis, and if we look at the industry as a whole, as opposed to your targeted good selves here, maybe there is a fact that we don't necessarily make much best use of it. And that's not unsurprising. It's variable material. We don't necessarily have a history of knowing what's in it. We may know that it may give us a bit of added extra or a value, but realistically, it's not an easy account to work out what's in it. We buy in bagged NPK or liquid, we pay good money for it, but the analysis is on the side of the bag. And we know that we've got a concentrated material that is uniform and we can spread reasonably well. So we'll have a think about the difficulties of working out the nutrient content. Nitrogen is all over the shop. It is potentially really useful, but is quickly moved and changed, and year on year, field by field, season by season, it's not easy to work out the nitrogen turnover, the availability to the next crop. a lot of folk would be promoting and talking, and I'll be using it a fair bit, some of the guidance, RB209, the Nutrient Management Guide, coming from the old MAF and DEFRA documents and now managed in England by AHDB. Routinely updated every couple of years in terms of slurry and muck analysis. And that will give us some idea of the nitrogen availability, but only to the next crop. It won't give us a forecast of the nitrogen that's left over, particularly from non-available forms that may start to give us some use in crop 3, crop 2 and crop 3 in the rotation, if we're thinking about a cropping cycle, or further release in a grassland situation. We'd have to shift into more sort of software tools and models to give us some idea of that. There are ones out there which give us at least some theoretical value of what would be nutrient release in months and years to come. Spreading practices getting better, but that's coming with cost, more targeted equipment. We are gradually shifting and being forced to move to what is grandly called low emission spread technology. Certainly up in Scotland and Northern Ireland, that's ahead of us here in England and Wales in terms of what's going to come on the agenda or what's already here in terms of those practices and how we spread. And that may make some saving, but it's going to come at cost that we'd be dealing with there. So thinking about the variability and turning that round and trying to think about shifting the fact from a poorer confidence value in at least having some way of trying to promote best system. So I suppose really what I want to cover in the rest of the talk is this: can we get a good handle on what's in it, at least some theoretical value, and try and keep to that. And again, thinking about what's total nutrients, what potentially could be then available and come available in the in future release. Where are we going to think then about spreading? And once we've done that, then how precise? So we could be thinking about what we're using, what kit, where, what time, the vagaries of the seasons, how our spring develops, and then if we shift into the autumn time, what are our stores like, our lagoons, where's the working window and the spreading window? And then that nutrient change, how quickly will it give us that reliable crop need that we'd be wanting to think about? So key main steps, and there's nothing dramatically new here. If we can at least get a bit of an idea of the nutrient content in that material and an appreciation of how variable it could be. We may spend some money on a test kit or send it to the labs. And absolutely, that's a great way of giving us some more realistic nutrient content. But that's not going to give us how much is going to be available to the crop. It'll tell us the theoretical available nitrogen in that material. We'd have to add on some of our own local field by field sort of understanding to actually say, well, how much of that theoretically readily available nitrogen is actually going to shift towards that crop need that we'd be thinking about. Timing, that may be forced by legislation on us, or we may be thinking about the practicalities of the spread patterns and the working windows and our rotations. But where can we aim to do that in a way then to hold on to those nutrients that are at risk of loss and are at concern to the environment? Is our working window chiefly coming out of the winter through the spring and into early summer? Where's the working window in possibly the autumn where we could use some of that material? Spreading technology, improving, definitely, but again, the investment needed for that. But overall, thinking about building that into some nutrient management plan, whether that hits the need for assurance or the schemes we're in, whether it's keeping on the right side of any environmental inspection, and they're ramping up at the moment, whether it's to build in for some of our newer schemes when we think about the development maybe in terms of SFI or equivalents in some of our devolved countries. So where could we get some theoretical nutrient content? Section 2 of RB209 is just one example that we'd be dealing with here. So the nutrient management guide, whether we think it's useful or not, AHDB produced, we'll see that last updated this last summer for section 2. Funded trials in muck and slurry analysis will go into here, and we get these tables of theoretical nutrient value. And some examples then of treatment systems. Have we got a separator that we're dealing with, a weeping wall? How will that make a difference just in terms of our nutrient content? How realistically equivalent is the dry matter of our slurry compared to what the book will tell us that we'd be seeing there? It's not the only source, but it's a routine one, and it will give us our theoretical total nutrients and the theoretical readily available nitrogen in that material. We could send a sample off, and it was great to hear that result. I suppose a sample is only as good as is that a sample of the realistic material we've got. How do we get a realistic sample? How much do we get? Where do we get it from in the store? That we deal with there, and is it best just ahead of spreading? Maybe to the state of even just getting that sample out of a liquid tanker or the muck spreader ahead of spreading that we'd be dealing with there. We pay money for that. Further costs involved, the lab that we would use, that would give us more detailed analysis that we'd be dealing with there. We'd actually get the theoretical readily available nitrogen in that lab result. There are a few slurry testers on the market. They're okay, they're talked about, they will give us an indication. That one up on the top here that we see, it's basically a tube in which we mix a slurry sample with a bleaching agent, and it'll measure us available ammonium N in the slurry. We could look super high tech and just dunk a slurry hydrometer in a bucket of slurry, and a slurry hydrometer will give you a recording of dry matter, and they generally come with correlation charts on whether that dry matter is then what percentage of N and P2O5 is in that material. And as we move on, we are definitely getting better in terms of real in-time flow cells and on spreaders, inline nutrient flow cells. So that's typically done by near infrared. So on slurry tankers and spreaders that we'd be dealing with there. The labs are typically often doing slurry and muck analysis by near infrared instead of the old-fashioned digestion. That may make the sample analysis a bit cheaper. And it's all done on correlations. So if we can get a flow cell, we can get an indication of dry matter. The software then will connect that to nutrients delivered, and that may be linked into a variable rate spread, shut-off, automatic shut-off, and release that we'd be dealing with there. So we can get an idea of the nutrient value. But prior to that, there's a huge amount that will affect that basic nutrient content in that material that we'd be dealing with. So the stock that we're thinking about, the livestock categories, the age that we'd be thinking about, the feed value going in, the genetics, what are we doing in terms of farm storage ahead of spreading? Is it typically covered or uncovered? Are we pushing it through a separator? That we'd be dealing with there? Is there some form of just non-mechanical separation, possibly adding some biological agents if we think that they are of value, so slurry bugs? Do we break up any crusts and stir ahead of treatment? Is it going through a digester? All of that will affect. And water, certainly a subject at the moment when we think about the amount of free water, I suppose, that's come down, and how much of that has got into our system as well that we'd be thinking about. So what does this give us? So this is some results back from one of the big commercial labs. And along the bottom axis, we have got the thickness of the slurry that we'd be dealing with there. And then up the left-hand side is the nitrogen content. So generally, there's a reasonably good relationship with how thick the material is, the dry matter, undigested protein material, solid matter, and the nitrogen tied up in there. And that will depend on the diet, how much water's got in the system from a fairly weak, well-watered slurry down here, or off a slurry separator to something that's pretty neat out of the backside of the animal, or to up here, that may be moving and shifting more to the solids coming off a separator. But but RB209 will just give us that standard figure. If it's 6% dry matter slurry, the nitrogen in it is 0.26. But that's the variability. That there is the variability of the samples at 6%. So if we're going to use 0.26, it could be much weaker than that, or we could be 3 or 4 times more nitrogen in that material than we thought we had if we were just using the book value. So yeah, there is some actual value in using some form of slurry analysis. These are some results back from NRM labs, and this is for solids. So if we're looking here chiefly at cattle strawed muck or sheep muck, beef muck, pig muck that we'd be dealing with there. So if we just looked at it straight out of RB209, 25% dry matter beef muck would have 6 kilos per ton of nitrogen, pretty much what the mean value is in the labs, but we'll see how considerably variable that was there. And we see that on the graphs. The height of the graph is the realistical mean. That's the outlier, the most concentrated muck in terms of nitrogen content, and then the weakest down below here. So again, there is variability in that material. And if I just whiz through these are produced by NRM labs. This just shows the correlation. Cattle and pig slurry, the thicker the material and the more nitrogen. Good relationship down here, but as that starts to get thicker material and it's more variable, maybe just in terms of the organic matter in there and the nitrogen content, we start to see more chatter, more variability. But using a slurry hydrometer that would measure dry matter that's then correlated to nutrients would give us a bit of an indication. Basically, the number nearest 1 would be the neatest and most connected direct correlation. As that number drops, then that's a weaker correlation that we'd be seeing there. So there's your total nitrogen and slurry. Shifting to phosphate, is there a relationship between the thickness of the material and the phosphate? Yeah. In sort of thicker materials, it's certainly more variable. Some of that phosphate is going to be water soluble. Some of that would be tied up in that undigested released organic matter that we'd be dealing with there. And then finally, the potash. It's just one graph here for cattle slurry, and that's more variable that we'd be seeing there. And part of that is linked into the fact that that potash is the most available. Quite a bit of that would be associated with the more liquid component of that slurry, and not necessarily all of that potash tied in with the actual organic matter that's excreted that we'd be thinking about there. A few words then just in terms about the variability of nitrogen and trying to get a handle on at least trying to predict where that availability is most likely to be used that we'd be thinking about. And that introduces the term of readily available nitrogen and crop available nitrogen. And quite a bit of a talk about high RAN manures and low RAN manures. And in terms of our environmental bodies and legislation, and certainly now in England, the interpretation of the farming rules for water, when materials are applied back to land in terms of land value, there is certainly considered to be more risk from high readily available nitrogen manures. So a strawed beef muck would be a low RAN material. A cattle slurry would be classified as a high RAN material. So we'd have to jump through more hoops to show the value of that material at certain times because of the risk in terms of losses. A high RAN material theoretically has good available N for the plant. And what I'd often be saying to the students or on a training course was, can you make most of that RAN to the crop as opposed to making it available to the sky and the water course? You've got some useful, valuable nitrogen in that material. You want to head it to the soil and to the grass and the fodder and the crop, not send that ammonium and nitrate towards the stream, the water course, the borehole, or the sky. So These again are the flow charts out of RB209. It gives us an indication then of which are high or low RAN materials, and the guidance and the legislation works on the fact that if more than 30% of your nitrogen is in a readily available form, it's classified as a high RAN manure. So basically the uric acid and the ammonium N is theoretically readily available for use. So you'd be looking on your slurry here and your digestate and your poultry litter as being high RAN materials, where because that component here is more than 30% of the total. Down here, then that's a low RAN material because we're not getting much early available N. Most of it is organic and would need to be broken down by the soil activity at a later stage to make that further mineralized and used. So there's less risk in terms of when we'd be spreading that and potentially losing those materials. So the sludge cake, the straw and muck would be a low RAN material. And again, we can get a correlation between solids and ammonium N. It may be more realistic to think about the ammonium N or the nitrate N rather than the total N. So it's all about, once we've gone spreading, holding on to the key useful quick hit nitrogen, but also trying to keep hold of this that would be further released as we go along. We don't want it to head off as ammonia gas. That's not a greenhouse gas, but there's a key issue with ammonia and the wider environment. If we lose some of that nitrogen once the soil's got hold of it through denitrification on wet waterlogged soils, then that could be lost as nitrous oxide greenhouse gas. Big interest in that. Or the long-standing concern may be in terms of nitrate leaching. We've had NVZs for some time. When are the conditions for that? So if we can try and reduce some of those and think about when we can spread it accordingly and bump up the available N so that ultimately we get the best use of it that we'd be thinking about over there. So whether it's freely available early on or it's going to be released at a later stage by mineralization, making sure most of that goes through the blue arrow as opposed to the red arrows here that we think about. And we've had NVZs, we've got ammonia controls now, trying to basically do the best to help to hold on to that theoretical material. Now that will only be, if we use RB209, we will only get an estimate of that in year one that we'd be dealing with for the first crop. What would be released in subsequent years, we'd have to then use some form of software to give us an idea of that. So getting an idea.
Got another question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Would mushroom compost be useful in grass-based systems?
Right. Well, yeah, theoretically, it's a good, useful material that we hold on to there. It's concentrated and it's made a lot of those nutrients available. So it's typically more useful nutrients than typical long-standing compost. I don't have a massive amount of sort of experience with it, but there is much quicker hitter nutrient turnover than more traditional woody type compost. Or green material compost. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So you may be aware of things like something like Manna free software or the Farm Crap app, delightfully named Farm Crap app Pro, which gives us a bit of a modeled indication of how much would be released then once you put in the field-based system. What's your soil type, the rainfall? Am I spreading it at the back end or in the spring? Am I working it in? Is it going for first cut, second cut onto a growing crop? All of that would actually give us an idea of further estimation of this and refine that we'd be thinking about. So here's a bit of an output page from Manna NPK. So from this software, you've entered all the details, your spread rate up here, the field details, the manure analysis. And this actually tells us now, it predicts how much would be lost and how much would be released in the following year. Not from this quantity, not a huge amount. So that would be telling us that from the 194 nitrogen sitting in that material, 114 would be available to the crop. That's a 59% nitrogen efficiency that year. with a further release in year 2. But would there have been further losses of that material? It also will tell us the other nutrients that we've not talked about yet too much: the P, the K, the sulfur and the magnesium. So yeah, Farm Crap app developed down in the southwest of England. So funded project from the British Grassland Society, Duchy College, and some funded work down there. So again, another tool. And there are various companies develop software decision support tools for slurry analysis. So that theoretical nitrogen availability will be hugely different depending on the situation, the soil type, when am I spreading it. It could be as low as 5% delivered to the crop, as high as 65% on a more receptive soil, using a precision spread system in the springtime. So nitrogen is much more variable. P and K, interesting. These are out of RB209. Pretty much any farm-based muck or slurry, look up the tables in RB209 and it'll tell you about half of that phosphate is going to be available to the next crop. Whereas your potash is your best bet in terms of next crop nutrient availability, whether it's a solid, a liquid, pig, cattle based material, uniformly quoted as 90% available for that crop value that we'd be thinking about there. Not so much on things like sulfur and magnesium return. There's one single table of sulfur availability in RB209. There hasn't been a huge amount of trials evidence, so I imagine this will get more in the future. But there is some valuable sulfur coming out of our muck and slurry, particularly some of our solids. And when we think we're not getting sulfur from the atmosphere like we used to a generation or so ago, we've cleaned up our air, we've reduced the emissions, but we're not getting the sulfur for grass and for rape and for winter wheat that we need. So again, there can be some sulfur release. So if we've got an idea of the theoretical nutrient value, we've tried to use maybe some form of analysis or assessment. How can we then improve some of the spread rates? Getting an idea of quantity. We may get a theoretical what would be the value from, but how realistic do we know what we're spreading? Now, on a tanker side, that's probably easier. We know the capacity of the tanker, the delivery on the splash plate maybe, or the boom. We know the pump, we know the actual delivery, the forward speed. On a solid spreader, whether it's side or rear discharge, it would be a bit more variable. What's the overfill? What's the density of that material? Could we weigh it empty or full weight bridge just to get some idea? That particular quantity there on the right, just over 12 tonne. And when we think about a typical spread rate that we'd be dealing with there, 40 tonne a hectare of beef cattle muck will give us our 250 kilos of total nitrogen. That is deemed to be a maximum amount of total nitrogen spreading guidance on an annual basis through sort of codes of good practice or NVZs that we'd be dealing with. And what's a typical spread rate? These are some photos from the dim and distant past from the muck events where guess the spread rate. So plots set up, just working out a typical spread rate and then actually converting that into the actual spread value that we've got there, and whether that's then worked in just to give us a typical spread rate. Liquors, not quite so easy because obviously we want it to work in, and the thinner the material, the quicker it'll work its way in. We often talk about typical spread rates of slurry. Guidance and legislation may restrict us to 30 to 50 cube a hectare, up to just over 4,500 gallons an acre that we'd be delivering there. And again, that may be linked into NVZ controls or some of those other factors. So at least giving us an idea of how much have we actually spread in terms of liquid rates. And do we ever recheck our spreaders? So this is some interesting data from the Farm Practices Survey. Big emphasis on recalibrating FERT spreaders that we'd be dealing with there, our sprayers and our fertilizer disc spreaders, and getting an annual recalibration. So do we do the same on our muck spreaders or slurry tankers? Historically, no. Some do. The cost involved, and again, just giving us an idea of the effectiveness of that spread. Certainly, the delivery would not drop down so much as to say with a fertilizer spreader, with some of the changes with the spinning discs that we'd be seeing there. So, is there a need to do that on an annual basis, or maybe on a less routine basis? So I'll finish off with then just thinking mainly a bit about, once we've spread, how are we going to try and keep hold of that material? A lot of emphasis in the work on the past, from losses down to water. We've had nitrate vulnerable zones in this country, in the UK, since the late 1990s. Whether we think they are doing any good in reducing the nitrate story that we'd be dealing with there, but generally this was some of that early work. This was where Harper was linked in as well. We had some long-standing trials spreading both liquids and solids on different months of the calendar year, and then trying to measure the nitrate lost from that material down into groundwater that we'd be dealing with there. So significant losses from our liquid-based slurries in terms of nitrate in the autumn time that we'd be thinking about there. And that's now built into the farming rules for water, whereby is there an actual soil and crop value from spreading high readily available nitrogen manures like slurries and digestates at the back end of the year, if most of it would be lost then over the winter. Most of this would be, we may be spreading it and holding it onto it there, but the soils are still warm enough and mineralizing it to break down that material further to create that nitrate that then may be lost through the winter rain. But with our solid mucks, and they're a low RAN material, less significant risk. The nitrate leaching risk from solid mucks is significantly lower, as you can see there. And that's never been part of closed periods in nitrate vulnerable zones in this country. We've never had those closed periods for solid manures that are high RAN materials. And this was some work we did, trials work on what was called the DC Agri project. So this was linked more into digestates and composts, DC. We were one of the centres looking at that for a period of about 5 years. So this was spreading digestates, pig slurries and pig muck, and the different ways of spreading it. So this is nitrate leaching risks. So again, our slurries and our digestates, significant nitrate losers compared to our solid mucks, be that a compost brought in or pig or cattle strawed muck that we're dealing with there. So generally, if it's a high RAN material that potentially lost through nitrate leaching, think about spreading that in a way that we can hold on to it in such a way that may be improving its utilization, or at a time of year where there could be a crop need. So late cut grass, sort of early autumn drilled rape where there's a nitrogen need, and that may take that up there, but less so for sort of winter drill cereals. And the whole discussion about spreading those materials in the autumn where the actual nitrogen value would be the spring. Bigger emphasis now perhaps on ammonia. We're seeing that. Big emphasis on how it affects the wider environment and human health. We're encouraged to look at precision spreading kit. That's being enforced steadily through legislation. They are good at reducing ammonia losses, but they will come with a cost. So whether we adapt a current system with maybe a trailing shoe or a trailing hose onto instead of a traditional splash plate on the back of a vacuum tanker, or a massive big system at high cost from the word go, or is it a contractor ring spread situation? And if we can hold on to that ammonia, then that is good, because that is theoretical available N to the crop. And actually, most of that ammonia is going to disappear within the first day or so. So there is an emphasis in getting it worked in or getting it spread in within that first day. Now, this is not necessarily saying that strawed muck is losing the most ammonia, but what proportion of the theoretical ammonium in that material would be lost as ammonia gas. So in other words, we're basically feeding the sky instead of the crop and the soil. So this is the proportion of the theoretical ammonium nitrogen lost as ammonia gas. And once we're past a day or so, then really that starts to tail off. So most of that emphasis is getting it worked in early on. And this just shows us this is the British Survey of Fertiliser practice. If material is spread and worked in and going on to a cropping rotation, not grassland, how much is actually worked in? So we can roughly see here, typically, if we're looking at sort of maybe strawed muck or cattle slurry, we are getting, whether it's on an area or a volume, quite a sizable amount is worked in within a day or so. So you can see there 50% of the solid muck or just over 50% of the slurry would be worked in within that first day for those folk who take part in that particular survey that would be dealing with there. So yeah, people are knowing the value and getting that and allowing that to at least work its way in, as opposed to sort of disappearing off up towards the sky. And the precision equipment will help to reduce that. So these are the results from that DC Agri trial. So cattle slurry here, so surface broadcast, so splash plate, and then using a trailing shoe or injection, maybe a reduction of 20, 30 or 50%. But we have to think of how is that compromised? The cost, the fuel, the time, all of that would be an important aspect to theoretically think about as well. And again, just looking at the comparison between two high RAN materials, digestate and slurry, whether broadcast with a tanker and splash plate or band spread with some form of boom system, umbilical dribble bar, possibly with a trailing shoe. But the ammonia loss from our FYM, again, is much lower. So that we'd be dealing with there when we look at proportion lost, that we'd be thinking about. Slurries, more so than muck, it's less than 24 hours. Most of that ammonia from slurry spreading or a liquid spread, if it's going to be going, it's going to be going within the first 6 to 10 hours. So again, the thickness of the material, whether it's just going to work its way in naturally because it's a thinner material, versus maybe also the conditions on the day, the wind speed, the temperature, all of that could accelerate that ammonia loss as well. And what's our history of spread currently at the moment? So the final things just to show you here. So this is the British Survey of Fertiliser practice up to 2022. Over the period there of what are we looking at? Maybe 15 years or so. So broadcast, tanker and splash plate, that we'd be thinking about. Band spread, is that going to carry on increasing? Is that because it's enforced? Or we may be getting grant aid for that. So when we think about the farming equipment, the Farming Equipment and Technology Fund, so 60% grant aid there for shifting towards more low emission spread systems, or where that is now enforced, for example, with Scottish requirements or Northern Ireland requirements, and where's that moving towards gradually over the period of the next few years. So this is slurry injection, shallow injection and deep injection, traditional old rain gun or a rotating boom, winch spreader. Pig slurry, more variable, whether that's because that's more contractor led, that we'd be thinking about there, and perhaps more precision based systems. But then we've got maybe bigger units, more investment, and more localized situations. And very finally, just to talk up the value, not necessarily just in nutrients, but in slow build. Big emphasis now on building soil organic matter, soil health and quality. And some of our strawed materials and solid materials can be useful carbon builders over time. So when we look here, strawed muck in comparison with bought-in compost. So again, we're helping to build that valuable organic carbon. And my final sort of trial results was some work we did on a long-standing, well, we used some long-standing treatment work here at Harper on this, and that was put into a soil quality project that ran over 3 years, a decade or so ago at sites across England, Wales and Scotland. But prior to that, that was our rotation for 3 years there. But we had results for 20 odd years of slurry and beef muck spread on grassland systems and compost for less than 10 years. And we showed the value of that. So both compost and strawed muck, bulky long-term builders, were showing real significant changes in building soil organic matter. Now, this is not soil organic matter as a percentage. This is the change over that period. So we're not seeing organic matter at 20%. We're seeing that change in build. So 1/5 build in the percentage of organic matter that was there to start with by using routine applications of strawed-based muck over 20 years. Whereas your livestock slurries, we're not seeing those as an organic matter build. And that may be in terms of soil biology. This will be a developing area in the future. And then just in soil workability. So our strawed muck and our bulky composts will help to reduce bulk density, make our soils more workable, improve soil structure, water holding capacity, the whole advent of however our soil's got to cope with the vagaries of the climate that we're dealing with at the moment. And I've mentioned the 250 guidance or law or rule. If this is the amount of nitrogen we're supposed to be spreading on an individual field when we spread an organic material, just because the variability of the material, what does that mean in the actual physical quantities we spread? From 10 tonne of poultry muck right through to nearly 100 cube per hectare of a dairy slurry. And all of that, those variable quantities on the right, are delivering the same quantity of total nitrogen. So to summarise then, folks, as I've gone over, try, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here already, get a good handle of the available nutrients if we can, suitable spreading times and useful fields, follow good guidance where we have to tie in with legislation, because if that helps us to keep hold of the nutrients, we're making significant savings short term in fertilizer value and maybe in terms of soil quality build over time. It's not necessarily easy, but whatever we can do to sell the message then is moving us in the right direction. Or ultimately what I'd probably put in front of some of our students to try and get a bit of a thought process. How much are we spreading? When are we doing it? Onto what crop in a rotation or grassland timing in a decent way as possible. And I think my final slide is, what will the future bring us? What are we shifting towards? Slurry bags, slurry covers, the whole new techniques maybe in slurry acidification or slurry cooling, enforcement of low emission spreads, and the whole aspect of the livestock feed efficiency system. Nitrogen in, nitrogen out. Where are we transferring most of that nitrogen into animal gain in terms of meat and milk and off-put directly off the farm? And there we are, folks. I hope that's been of interest at least. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. And Katie, over to your good self.
Thank you very much, Paul. We've had another couple of questions just come in. What nutrient value would farmyard manure be? Sorry, let me start again. Would the nutrient value of farmyard manure be less by using sawdust instead of straw?
No, not necessarily. I can come back to you and direct, if I dig out some trials evidence and feed that back to you, Katie, to pass on. But realistically, some of that would help us with that material in microbial turnover and making some of that nitrogen theoretically more available. It wouldn't necessarily change the total nutrient bank, but it could affect how much of that would be theoretically readily available in that material. So yeah, because it would affect, you know, the microbial activity and that breakdown of that material. So yeah.
Yeah, okay. If spreading cattle slurry using a trowel chute as compared to a splash plate, what are the financial savings in terms of losses prevented?
Okay, so what we'd have to work out there would be, and this will probably be a sit on the fence politician's answer, rather than give an actual figure that we'd be dealing with there. We'd be looking at maybe comparing that with the cost of the actual fuel use, the time, the labour, the spreading conditions on the soil type, the temperature that we'd be spreading there. So there's no immediate easy answer to that. I would generally think that realistically a trailing shoe or an umbilical dribble system is going to give you theoretically a better, quicker and cheaper return than shifting into an injection system by far. But it's not immediate. It's not, I don't want to be the sort of doom monger on there. If we think about why this is currently incentivized in grant aid, that's what they're trying to encourage us to do. But we need further assistance to try and make that financially available, that we'd be thinking about there. And if we're trying to be encouraged to move towards that, it's interesting where that's now being embedded in things like, incentivization grants. The same with slurry covers. There's a lot of upfront costs to shift into moving into something like that will give us some long-term returns, but is not going to be an immediate quick hit that we deal with there. But I'll try and dig out some actual sort of spread rate, just as some figures to give to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Has anybody else got any more questions? Use the raise your hand or type them in the chat. I know a few people have disappeared because I know there's another meeting at 8 o'clock in Northern Ireland, so I know some people have gone off to that. So but yeah, if anybody else has got a question, type it in the chat quickly, and if nothing comes through, thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your knowledge with us. We will, as always, put these onto YouTube, so those that have registered that couldn't attend will be able to catch up on it at a later date. And I have recently arranged, we'll have another meeting on the 24th of April with Jude Capper with an update on PRISM of where we are, what we found out so far. And then on the 1st of May, I've got Dave Davis, who will be talking about silage and silage making and how you can get the best from your silage. So I see we have just had.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment back. Steve, yeah, absolutely. You've still got to pay 60% of that costs. There would be some short-term savings, gradually in maybe more nutrient efficiency, but it's going to take time to get that return that you're dealing with there. So yeah.
And as with all of the grant schemes, you've got to pay it all out up front and then jump through the hoops to claim it back a lot of the time with the DEFRA grants, etc.
Yeah, composting, cattle FYM, make nutrients more available. Yes, it will. Theoretically, that could leach if it's the wrong time, but generally, it would. They're more likely to be in a form to be held onto just because of the form of that material. But yeah, you generally found that typically you are going to get more of that as long as that composting is sort of done in a decent way, with a bit of mixing and turning to actually get that nutrient release that we'd be dealing with.
And the last part of Mike's question was, where's the best place to do it, in a field or in a yard?
Oh, right. Okay. Theoretically, probably in the yard. You've got more control, in terms of management. But realistically, I realise that it may actually be easy to do in the field. It may be that typically you may, on a yard-based system, is it a covered area? You've got less vagaries of the weather hitting it as well. That we would be dealing with. So yeah, are there any losses? Then yeah, theoretically, the theoretical losses could be there because you've made some of that nutrient more available. So a lot of that would be depending on what soil type you'd spread it on and when you'd be spreading it on, following any turning or composting value that we'd be dealing with.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending this evening. And those of you that were in the discussion groups before Christmas, I have sent out an email again on some combined discussion group dates as well for those that can attend. I know people will be busy lambing and carving over the next few weeks and months, but those that can attend obviously look forward to speaking to you there. And thanks again, Paul, for sharing your
pleasure.
Expertise this evening. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, happy to get involved, you know, in anything you want, or direct, get in touch with me, anyone, find me through Harper, that'll be fine. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And I'll share what Paul sends through to me with everybody that's attended.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye. Thanks, Katie. Yeah.
Thank you.